I'm stronger now than I've ever been at 43, but I know more about what to do. I know more about my recovery. I have a better dietary intake. I eat way more protein. I focus on sleep. I don't stay out all night. Like, all those variables allow my body to get these adaptations.
Hey y'all, welcome back to the Struggle Climbing Show. I'm Ryan Devlin, and I am your aging athlete host of this pro clinic that's focused on how aging athletes like myself, or as Tyler defines it, basically anybody over the age of 30, can not just maintain, but in fact gain strength, recruitment, power, and hypertrophy well into our older years of climbing and just being humans. I'm talking about 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And yes, even beyond. He's citing some really compelling science, some studies that have come out over the recent months and longitudinal studies over many years that kind of blow up this preconceived notion that I've had, certainly, and even in conversations that I've had on this podcast, that as you get into your older years, or in fact beyond even your kind of mid-20s or 30s, you start to lose strength and power. And while that is true in a sense, Tyler explains why it isn't true in a sense, and why it certainly does not have to be true. And Tyler, as you just heard from the opening pull quote there, is stronger now in his early 40s than he's ever been in his life. I, in my mid-40s, am stronger than I've ever been in my life and performing better on rock and just feel better in life. And there's no reason, as Tyler explains in this pro clinic, that shouldn't be the case into our 50s, 60s, and beyond as we become masters athletes in this sport that we love so much. So if you're in your teens or your 20s or your 30s, listen up. Tyler talks about things that you can be doing to set you up even better as you get into your master's years. And if you, like me, are a little bit older now, you're in your 30s, 40s, or beyond, oh, this one's just full of not only actionable data, but also a ton of stoke. Like, we can and we will continue to just get stronger and get better in this sport if we heed a lot of the advice and the principles that Tyler lays out in this conversation. And we get very specific here. And by we, I mean Tyler. I play the dummy as always, but Tyler lays out specific programs for muscular hypertrophy, strength and recruitment, power. We're talking about set and rep schemes for a 5-day program, what to do in season and off season, how to train some of this stuff during a warm-up so you aren't adding a lot, what fatigue means, and in fact, kind of the fallacy of fatigue and how we can program our workouts so we feel even better when we're climbing, and where finger training comes into play with all of this stuff, because it's not just about maintaining muscle into our older years, but also maintaining tendon stiffness and elasticity. Tyler talks about all of that stuff, and he brings, as always, a ton of science to back it all up. I'm so psyched that you're here. Let's just get into it right now, y'all, with a masters athlete himself, Dr. Tyler Nelson. Thanks for taking the time. We kind of threw this chat together because you made a post not too long ago about muscle degradation and gain in kind of older athletes. And just immediately, I was so psyched on the science that you were citing. And I guess maybe before we dive into like the science of that paper and then, what does it mean for all of us as climbers, it might be good to understand a little bit of the definitions of like what an older climber is. How old are you, Tyler?
I'm 43.
Okay. I'm 46. And so I see definitions out there, older climbers, masters climbers, post 30, like what as just kind of specifically through the lens of climbing, or maybe it's defined kind of in sports in general, but what are like the age groups that we can kind of generally break ourselves into, understanding that obviously everybody's genetics are a little bit different and some will probably feel older than they are or younger than they are, depending on what kind of genetic lottery they've won.
I think most masters like athletes is like 35 older even.
Wow.
That's like in competition sports. Yeah, that's young for sure. And the great news for aging athletes beyond that is it's not like a steady decline. And so that narrative that there's a steady decline in muscle force and muscle mass, et cetera, is largely anecdotal, and it largely comes from disuse and dietary changes and just people being more sedentary. But I think classically 35 from a competition setting. Depends on the sports, like some of the, and we're talking about climbing, not bodybuilding, but bodybuilders, some of the peak bodybuilders happen at 35 to like 43 years old.
Yeah, and I do think it's important for us climbers as we're listening to this, these definitions pertain to kind of where are we in our genetic life cycle, for the sport, being over 35 or being a quote unquote masters. I kind of like the term masters, in fact, because I think what it refers to is that you've got a lot of experience. I mean, assuming you didn't just start practicing the sport at age 40. I mean, I started practicing the sport at age 30 and didn't even start trying hard with my training and performance until age 40. So I don't know if I would consider myself a master at this point in time. I'm older for sure, but I like that terminology because I think, especially with climbing, while fitness matters, while strength matters, and that's going to be the main focus of this conversation, experience matters, technique matters, and this encyclopedia of how to move over rock matters. And so at 35, you're likely going to have much more experience and knowledge about how to move as a rock climber than you would at 15 or 25. And then maybe at 55 or 65, even more so. And we'll talk about, what happens to the body between those years. But I do like that term of master's athlete. And are there any other terms that we should know, I guess, in terms of kind of how we're going to break up this conversation before we dive into it?
No, I think we'll talk about more physiology terms, but not in regards to like age changes. But I think you're right. That term, I don't really know the etiology of that term in this context, but I'm assuming it comes from someone that grew up doing something their whole life, and then they're a master of that thing, and they're doing it because they're older, which I think that's cool. But obviously there's going to be variation. But in terms of like the decline, the only like after 60, there is a little bit of hypertrophy decline, but it's pretty steady down. But that only, according to the research, only accounts for 10% of the total variance in muscle strength and size and performance. So even after 60 years old, it's not the primary driver of why people lose performance.
And let's take some time to talk through this, because this was at the heart of your post, really what kind of blew my mind the most, because I've had conversations on this show with physical therapists and personal trainers and doctors and coaches and athletes. And one of the common refrains has been like, oh, after about age 30, you're going to be losing a few percentage of strength and maybe even more power every year. Do what you can to try to maintain it, but it's going to go down, and you can continue to build some fitness and technique. And it sounds like that refrain, if you will, or that line of thinking is rooted in data, but the data includes too wide of a pool, essentially people who aren't staying active. Is that what your recent kind of findings or that collection of studies was alluding to?
Yeah, when they do like large population data, like, lean mass declines linearly from age 20 onward, but it's mostly driven by sedentary behavior, people having reduced loads, so reduced intensity of their loading, poor nutritional choices, lower protein intake. It's not really just because they're getting older. It's really just lifestyle factors. And then also we'll talk about, like, you've had the experience of, if we only climb and we only go into climbing, that's obviously important for climbing performance, but that's not the same thing as keeping the intensity up on the tendons and the muscles of the shoulders, the chest, the back, and the hips. And so people will lose a little bit of strength if they're not doing high intensity strength training. That for sure is the case.
Okay. So then when we pull out the people who just after age 20, kind of give up on sports and strength training, and I guess that makes sense. You're more active when you're younger, you're maybe doing organized sports, or you've just got like physical education courses that are required through K through 12 and then sometimes into college. But then it's understandable. You get out of school or you get a job, you have a family, and stress sets in, and there's just less time to go out and be like active all the time. So I understand why when we cast a wide net, that's what the data shows. But are there studies then that are done specifically with people who stay active? And what does the data tell us there with regard to being 30, 40, 50 beyond?
Yeah, people that stay active can maintain muscle size. They can maintain stiffness in their tendons, which is helpful for power output, but they tend to need more recovery So as you know, and I know, like I can't have as many high intensity sessions in proximity to each other now that I used to when I was in my 20s. And so the needs kind of change with how you do the programming and also how you focus on your recovery. And then as we get older, we need more protein consumption, on average than we did when we were younger. But there shouldn't really be a huge difference. So it's like we get a little bit of reduction in anabolic sensitivity. So our building block processing essentially requires higher protein and a heavier and harder training stimulus to get the same adaptations.
Oh, got it.
So if we don't do high intensity things, the fast twitch fibers, which are the type 2 motor units, the ones that are powerful, they will lose in size if they're not loaded appropriately. But you have to try really hard. You have to keep the intensity up quite high. And that's how we maintain our power. But if we're only doing our sport and we're doing lots of our sport, we're not optimizing the recruitment of those muscle fibers regularly. That will minimize strength and muscle size.
Well, and you're going to lay out some specific ideas and protocols for masters, athletes, people above the age 30 or 35 on how to do all this, which I'm excited to get into. Before we do, I want to understand the profile a little bit more if we can. And specifically, is there a difference between men and women on how we retain or lose muscle in older ages?
Not really. The science does not show that it's that different, as long as we're selecting training protocols that the athletes understand, they get coordinated with, they're dosed appropriately, they get adequate rest, they still need high protein content. If it's done correctly, like building muscle and maintaining muscle, and as a consequence, keeping the tendons stiff and loading the bones, is most like strength conditioning researchers would argue that's like one of the most healthful things we can do as humans to get older and be healthy and, have active lives.
Yeah, beyond just climbing, we're talking about just having stronger bones and reducing depression and staying healthier is essentially lifting heavy. And we'll talk again about some of those protocols.
There's also a lot of just variation between people. Like I know lots of climbers like Jesse that works with me, he doesn't get big muscles. He gets stronger, but he doesn't really get much hypertrophy. So there's a lot of variation, between individuals, actually how much muscular hypertrophy they will get. And for the most part, for climbers, we're not really trying to emphasize everyone getting really big and bulky because there's some downsides to that for training. And so we want to separate, I'm not suggesting that everyone needs to get as swole as possible in all parts of their body, because that would be likely detrimental to some degree to performance, but getting some muscular size and hypertrophy during certain phases of the year for your training makes a lot of sense. And then we can kind of funnel that into something that is a little bit more lean and a little bit more recruitment and maximum strength focus. So everyone's not going to respond the same to strength training, is an important point.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'd actually like to understand that for a second. I'll try not to take us down too many rabbit holes in this conversation. I want to keep us on track here with the aging athlete thread. But you were talking about Jesse Firestone for a second there. And yeah, the guy's crazy strong, but he doesn't look built. And a lot of climbers exemplify that body type, men and women. And for me, there's an incongruity or a dissonance, if you will, with seeing somebody pulling crazy hard moves or lifting a ton of weight on a deadlift, for example, and not looking really big. And so is there just a dumbed down way that you can explain to me how somebody can be very strong without having a lot of visibly bulk, muscles?
It comes down to just maximizing their motor unit recruitment in given muscle groups. And the length of the muscle also matters. So people that have long muscles tend to have a lot of shortening potential. So they should be able to generate lots of force for their given size. But essentially, it's if we look at someone on a climbing wall, it's much easier to see that if you can use all four limbs and you can, distribute force and control force through all four limbs simultaneously, that's a huge advantage, right? Spiders have lots of legs for that reason. They can just stay on things because they can just distribute the load. Whereas if you can do that when you're doing heavy lifting stuff, it is much more just raw maximizing force. And that's why the best way for athletes that are climbing to maximize that force is done off the wall, and then at the smallest dosage possible. And then the actual transfer comes from the practice on the wall. And then the expression of that force on the wall does not happen until we spend time practicing on the wall. And so it's really important to have both. And there's a lot of kind of the traditional history of climbing is you just climb to get stronger at climbing. And I totally agree with that, but that will plateau for everyone. And once it does, we need to use something off the wall that is very stable and very safe and easy to understand and progress. And then we can maximize individual potential off the wall, and then they can continue to do their practice so they can just continue to try harder and harder moves.
I love that. And I will, for the listener, by the way, link in the show notes to some great conversations that I've had with you on building strength and power, with Colin McGee and Jesse Firestone, with Natasha Barnes. There's been a handful of really great conversations I've had on this show for all age ranges on essentially how to structure training to build strength and power off the wall and then be able to have more productive and safer sessions on the wall or out at the crag. So I will link to those. The focus here, of course, is on athletes who are 35 and older. Before we fully shift into that masters, if you will, age category, is there anything for the younger listener that's right now? Because if you're 20, at some point in time, you're going to be 35. Is there anything in the data or from your recommendations that could be done before you ascend into the masters category, before you get your AARP mailers starting to show up in the mailbox, that will help that much more when you do hit those older ages?
Yeah, well, I mentioned this already. The lean mass declines linearly after age 20 about. And so for youth athletes, it's really just about building a habit for them and understanding that the benefits you get with off the wall training is very comprehensive. It's for the bones, which will also stop getting more dense over time. And so we want to maintain that density. We want to build up that density as youth, but then when we get older, we no longer build that density, we hold on to it. But the only way we maintain that density is through mechanical load. And so for youth athletes, it's really just like understanding basic strength and conditioning principles, maybe learning 5 compound whole body movements that you can just continue to do long term. And that's a thing that you and I have talked about, and I've talked about a lot elsewhere, is it seems like people are looking for some special movement that looks and feels a certain way and looks like a climbing movement, et cetera. But the science is very strong with all sports that the basic strength training movement patterns that we train are enough for most athletes, almost every athlete, So I would have, and that's what we do for our certification courses. We teach coaches how to regress and progress basic movement patterns so athletes just develop that habit. And so really it's strength training is a habit. You have to enjoy doing it enough to do it a few times a week, and then you can modify that depending on the season and maybe drop that to once a week if you're in season. But making that habit and including it long-term is very helpful. It's very injury reductive, and it should continually allow athletes to progress on the wall.
Dig it. And we are going to get into some of these protocols, if you will, for those who are listening in a second. But because we're talking muscular right now, I wanted to touch on another big thing that we're always talking about as climbers, which is our connective tissue, our tendons, ligaments, that kind of thing. And is that part of this as well? Does like that type of thing decline over age, or are we really focused on muscular adaptations, gains and losses in this conversation?
Absolutely important to talk about tendon structural changes and what happens with strength training loads and what happens when we don't do strength training loads. Because one of the hardest things for the older athletes to be able to sustain, like I mentioned already, is like just the ability to keep the intensity high session after session. And so the recovery time frame for the tendon is a bit slower for an aging athlete. And so that's why using non-linear style programs makes sense for that population, where you have a really intense day where you go heavy intensity. You have a high power day where you're doing high powerful things. And then you're having a day where you're doing more volume at a lower intensity, because it's really the balance of loading that's going to be more sustainable, because we need all of those components. Where if we only climb, let's say, and we do lots of climbing volume. That's a low to moderate intensity load to the tendon, and that eventually will reduce tendon stiffness and it will increase like tendon stretch and strain. And that's kind of one of the hallmark behaviors of having a tendinopathy or a tendonitis that turns into a tendinopathy is lacking stiffness in the tendon. So absolutely, tendon adaptations come as a direct response to muscular loads. You can't just like load the tendon really fast and make it stiffer. You have to load the muscle at a really high magnitude to load a lot of the tendon as well.
And so just so I'm understanding from my point of view, when we're talking about like strength, it's heavier, slower movements. Power is fast movements. And then capacity or fitness is like higher volume of lower weight movements.
Yeah, lower intensity, high volume movements. Think about it as like arc training, or think about it as doing, just like long routes, like where you are in the red, climbing in the red. That would be very high volume kind of training, where power training, everyone knows in the climbing world, is going to be limit bouldering, really hard board climbing, and strength training is going to be something that has a lot of intensity, but an intentionally fast movement as well. So that's like one of the important kind of caveats there is if you're just doing a really heavy movement, but you're not trying to move that load very fast, you're not going to get the same response as if you loaded it very heavy, but you still tried to move it really fast. The tendon adaptations are a little bit better with that intention.
Can you give an example of that? Or like what an exercise might be that would do that?
So a really easy example, let's say doing like a pull-up. And so if I did my 1 rep max pull-up and I hooked a measuring device to my harness and I measured how fast I moved, right? And the pull-up for a 1 rep max is probably 0.17 meters per second. So pretty slow. And so if I did it at body weight, my body weight's about 50% of my max. So I have my 1 rep max at 0.17, and then my body weight is like 0.80. And so the difference in speed there is only really detected if you have a way to measure it. But even if I didn't have a way to measure it, like my 1 rep max pull up, I would still try and pull as fast as I can. On my body weight pull up, I would definitely pull as fast as I can, and the speed will be higher. So it's really the intention of the exercise is really important for the adaptation.
Interesting. So if I hook 50 pounds onto my harness to do a pull up and I can do 3 of those, it's much more beneficial that I do 3 of those as fast as I can rather than just 3 of those kind of at a more casual pace or a slower pace. The intention of trying to rip it as fast as I can makes more of a beneficial adaptation than if I'm just doing 3 that are a little slower.
Yeah. So when you say like, do them as fast as you can or rip it, right? People assume that's a tempo thing. So that doesn't mean do 3 as fast as you can. It means that the pulling up portion, the concentric portion of the movement should be as fast as possible. It should be intentionally fast, but you could lower down slow. You could even rest a couple seconds before you do the next one if you're going really heavy, because the adaptations that you're trying to get are mostly concentric anyways. And that's what's going to drive high levels of motor unit recruitment and elevate someone's potential for being powerful. Where the other counterexample, and we do this at the course with the power meter, is I hook it up to someone and have them just do pull-ups. Say, do 5 pull-ups. And there's an idea that doing slow movements is helpful for muscular adaptations, but that's not how the muscular system works. That doesn't work well. It's not the same thing if you're looking to gain maximal strength and power. So I'll have them do pull-ups and they'll be maybe 0.6, 0.7 meters per second. And then I'll have everyone kind of gather around and say, okay, now do the concentric part as fast as you can. And then the metric will jump to like, 0.8 to 1.0 meters per second. And so just like as a teaching metric, like if we're doing a strength training movement and we're trying to get strong, warm up, et cetera, we should do those movements, the concentric part of those movements, as quick as possible, with a concentric velocity focus so we gain better adaptations from it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate the examples and the clarity there. And then with regard to tendons, just in doing the movements that way and adding load if we're doing like a heavier lifting day or doing them fast if we're doing like a board climbing day, just that act will take care of the tendons as we age, or is there something more specific that we need to be focusing on, post 30 years old?
So, strength training practices are definitely the most accepted as means of keeping the tendon stiff and keeping the material properties of the tendon kind of optimized for performance. So what we'll talk about, the couple days per week of heavy strength training is definitely the most accepted method of increasing tendon stiffness. But we don't only want to increase tendon stiffness all the time. We also need a little bit of elastic recoil as well. So that's why we want kind of a balanced approach for aging athletes. But we don't only want to do elastic stuff. We don't only want to do stiffness stuff. We want to have a balance of those things. That's where proper programming really helps athletes not unintentionally, or in some cases intentionally, increase the dosage of a particular load too high that can be risky for getting injuries.
Well, maybe it makes sense for us to just dive into some of these sample programming ideas, and then we can talk through the science along the way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's cool. So guidelines, I would say for athletes over 40, like volume guidelines for muscular hypertrophy and strength, essentially we're looking.
All right, y'all, this seems like a good place here for me to fade out this free intro portion of this Pro Clinic with Dr. Tyler Nelson, but I am telling you, this is one that you're going to want to listen all the way through. So whether it's through a free trial over on Patreon or Apple subscriptions, or maybe you actually just want to help me out with $7 this holiday season, I'd really appreciate it either way. Let me tell you the knowledge and the actionable insights and beta and programming that Tyler drops in the rest of this Pro Clinic, which goes for another hour, a little bit more than another hour. And that is specifically, he gets into muscular strength, recruitment, and power protocols. So he lays out a 5-day program, what to do every day, how to work certain exercises into your warm-ups for climbing days, and what to do on non-climbing days so that you don't experience or carry a lot of fatigue, but that you do continue to tick the box to either maintain or even gain strength, power, hypertrophy, whatever you need right now in your climbing life, well into your master's years. He talks about how lifting sessions can fit into our climbing life. So do we lift before we climb, after we climb, on a different day than we climb? He goes through all of that. He also talks about specifically how to train our fingers and when to even stop training our fingers during certain seasons. And speaking of seasons, we talk about in-season programming and off-season programming. We talk about a winter programming schedule since we're pushing into the winter right now, at least at the time of releasing this episode. And we explore a lot of exercises and equipment that I haven't been using a lot of myself. So things like medicine balls and box jumps and kettlebells, things that you might find at the gym or that you can easily purchase for your own home workout setup. And that was really fascinating for me. And in fact, since having this conversation with Tyler, I've picked up a slam ball, which is kind of like a medicine ball, and a couple other things. And then lastly, we talk about one of the other very key parts of these studies, which is nutrition, supplementation, and sleep guidelines in order to, for older athletes, those who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and beyond, to fuel and support all of the work that we're doing to maintain our strength or even build our strength and power. And that's really critical information as well. All of that is in here. This is such an incredibly valuable Pro Clinic. I am so excited to have this out there for the community. And you can listen to it, as I mentioned, one of two ways. You can sign up for a free trial over at patreon.com/The Struggle Climbing Show, or through Apple subscriptions. Also, if you're a Spotify listener, that is linked and connected with Patreon, so you can add access to the Pro Clinics and bonus episodes right there in Spotify, or you can just sign up, and that'd be awesome. Happy holidays to me and to you, and I'm just hustling so hard over here in the podcast/utility closet. So if you're in a position to be able to sign up for a Patreon membership, man, I'd really appreciate it. And there's no obligation. You could listen to everything you can for a month. There's over 140 hours of bonus content in Pro Clinics right now in the library over on Patreon. And so, listen to it and then just quit if you don't like it or whatever. I really appreciate the support. So those links are right there in your show notes, along with some other links of the things that Tyler and I have talked about in this episode. Check all of that out. And thank you again for your support. I got to tell you, at 46 years old, I feel better than I've ever felt in terms of my physical health. And a lot of that is because of the things that Tyler lays out in this conversation here. And I just find it so exciting that my best years are not behind me, but are in front of me as a climber. And so if you are in that boat as well, I'd love to hear from you. You can hit me up on Patreon or on Instagram or through the website. And it's just been such a pleasure to be on this journey with you. I hope you're getting after it, and I will see you soon.